Hi, I'm Collier, and this is my story of how I survived my father murdering my mother when I was 11 years old. I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I guess I became aware of how unique my childhood was because I always grew up in fear of my father. My father had a very violent temper. He was a rageaholic. He could go apoplectic in a second. So as a child, my father was gone a lot as a doctor, so I was my mother's constant companion. I didn't see anything wrong with that or odd. I would see daddy on the weekends or daddy would come home at night, but I never really had like that much of a relationship with my father in a way, unless we were going as a family unit somewhere, right? As we got to moving to a small town in Ohio, where no one knows you, it's a chance for a little bit of reinvention, I suppose. My parents took advantage of that and created their own backstories. Now, my father, who we will discover is a psychopath, is also a pathological liar, which sort of goes hand in hand with that. He would have stories of, my father served in the Navy. My father was a doctor in the Navy. And I remember a story one time where he would tell me that he flew with the Blue Angels. He was a fighter pilot. And I would always ask, he's like, oh, they found my helmet. They're going to send it back to me. And my father was really hardcore on that Navy pilot thing. And this was a story that he was cultivating for the various women that he was seeing in his life. And those relationships took precedence over his family. And my mother shielded me from that. So I had no idea any of this was going on. My mother, let me just be very clear, my mother was most certainly not a pushover. My mother was very strict with me. I was a very well-behaved child. So my mother had been shielding me from another life that my father had been cultivating outside the household. And it wasn't until Father's Day. So on this particular day, my father went to go get a suntan at this location, and we run into this woman, Sherry. And she has arrived at this location and she has radio control cars and, as gifts for my father and I for Father's Day. I happen to look over and I'm looking at Sherry, who's sitting there with my father, and I noticed a ring on her finger that looked like my mother's ring that she had. It was a very unique ring, and I was a very perceptive little kid because I was an only child up to this point, and I had, an education was something that was so highly valued. I remember my perceptive wisdom saying, what are the odds here? And I said to her, that's a really nice ring, Sherry. My mommy has a ring like that. And she giggled and she looked at my father. I noted all this. And I was like, okay, I'm playing with the radio control car. Then I turn and look, and my father is kissing her, but he's making out with her. It's not anything that I've ever seen my father do. I've seen it in movies. And I knew that was not a friendly engagement. And my father says to me, he goes, look, Bumper, which is my nickname that he called me growing up, I need you to do me a favor. I want you to tell mommy that you got the radio control cars from me as a present for getting good grades this school year. Don't tell her about Sherry or anything like that. And I was like, okay, Dad. That was the first and only time I lied to my mother. And later on that evening, playing at the radio control car, and I was so overwhelmed with the guilt that I had told my mother a lie because I was so overwhelmed with that guilt. I came in to the porch and she was sitting there with my sister, and my parents had just adopted a little girl from Taiwan, my sister Elizabeth, because my mother wanted a daughter. So she was sitting there, and I said to her, Mommy, I have something I need to tell you. And she said, okay. And I told her, I said, I think Daddy's having an affair. So that was a really big deal for me to tell that to my mother because I was accepting that, okay, this is happening. My mother said, thank you for telling me. She's like, I'm not happy that you lied to me, but I understand why you did because your father asked you to do it. I'm sorry that he asked you to do that. She then proceeded to go inside the house, and she got on the phone, and it was very loud. My mother, unbeknownst to me, my father had crossed the line in the sand which was, you can do whatever the hell you want to do, Jack. Don't involve our kid. And once my father involved me and introduced me to his girlfriend, all bets were off. So it was many months later. So the holidays came, and it was New Year's Eve, 1989, and my father came with my grandmother, who is my father's mother, who is extremely close to my mother. And mind you, they're in the middle of a divorce, so this is like a tenuous situation in the household. And he brought my grandmother, and we all had dinner, and this, that, and the other. And I went to bed. At about 3:18 a.m., I woke up to a sound of a scream, and I heard two loud thuds about 60 seconds apart, and I was petrified. I'm in my bed, and I hear what I believe to be my father muttering, my father's voice muttering something. And then I count 12 footsteps as they walk down the hallway. And I always slept with my door open. I could see out of my peripheral vision the feet standing in the doorway. And something told me, don't look up. Because I firmly believe that if I had looked up in that moment, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I don't know how, but I went back to sleep. The next morning when I woke up, I ran straight to my mother's bedroom, and I noticed that the sheets in the bed was in a state of disarray. And I started looking for blood. I started looking for any sort of clue as to what happened to her, because my mother had never left my side. And I went downstairs, and my father was sitting on the couch. He had a towel wrapped around his waist. And I said, where is my mother? And my father said, well, Collier, mommy took a little vacation. And that's when I knew that my father murdered my mother. So my father had gone into this whole explanation of what had happened, what I had heard, the sounds. He said my mother threw her purse at him and her credit cards, left the house, slammed the door, got into a car that was waiting at the end of the driveway in the dead of winter, got into this car and just left. With no purse, no money, no coat, no nothing, got into a car and just left. And he kept imploring to me, we're not going to call the police, we're not going to call the FBI, we're not going to call anybody, we're going to just wait for mommy to come back. And I was like, yeah, that's not happening. My father left that day, and I had saved phone numbers of my mother's friends. I went upstairs, I got those numbers, I went into the bathroom, and I started calling everybody. I told them exactly what happened. I said, you need to call the police. Police showed up at the house, and my grandmother was apoplectic. She was so angry because your father said, don't call the police. I was like, I didn't call the police, Grammy. The police were walking around. My grandmother was hovering right behind me, so I couldn't say much. I told them sort of what happened. They left. Called the next day to my mother's friends, like, what's going on? And they said, well, we filed a missing persons case. I was like, she's not missing. Like, she's like dead, or he's done something to her. She's in a room somewhere. By chance, this detective by the name of Lieutenant Dave Messmore came out to the house. My grandmother was screaming at him, trying not to let him in. He comes in the house and he says, and my grandmother goes to call my father. Say, you're gonna pay for that. I'm gonna get my son on the phone. I say to Dave Messmore, I say, I can't talk here. Give me your card. My mother would never leave me. Something has happened to her. Give me your card. He gave me his card. Next morning I went to school because it was January 2nd, 1990. I walked into the principal's office and I gave her the card and I said, you need to call this guy. He came down to the school and I sat with Dave Messmore for probably hours and explained to him everything that I knew about my mother and father's relationship, my father's girlfriend, all of this. I said to him, I'm going to go home. While my grandmother's downstairs dealing with my adopted sister, I'm going to pull the bookshelves out of the wall and look for her body, because we had crawl spaces in houses. It's a thing in the East Coast. So I'm going to look for her purse to see, because she wouldn't have left the house without this one purse, even though my father says I'm going to look for these things. I did that, and I didn't find anything, obviously. And so over the course of the next 25 days, myself and this detective started piecing things together. Because my father is pretending to be very concerned about my mother. He has his attorney, his divorce lawyer over at the house. They're talking about things all the time, and they're posting signs outside the house, no police are welcome, because the police kept trying to come back to talk to my father. He wouldn't talk. He was never available. The lawyer is saying you can't come in the house, you can't talk to anybody, nobody wants to speak to you, the press, whatever it is, right? My father takes me to his office, and on the way back, he stops at a gas station, and I'm watching him through the windshield. I start rummaging through his truck, and in the center console, I find two photographs. One is of his girlfriend sitting in front of a fireplace that's covered in plastic with her two kids, and the second one is of a house that I've never seen before. I told police about that house. A few days later, and my father's behavior over this time, he's coming home and I noticed marks on his hands, so I'm telling police about that. My father came home one time and said he was sore from moving boxes to his new office. And all these strange behaviors were something that was just massive red flags. So I told Lieutenant Messmore this all over the course of January 1990, until I found the pictures of the house. I told him about this house. And then my father told me about a medical conference he had in January down in Florida. And every year we would go to these medical conferences in Clearwater Beach, Florida, but they were always during the spring when kids had off from school, so it coordinated with everyone's schedules. Not in like January, in January. And he said, we've just been such a rough go for you. I really want to have a bonding trip, because I know it's really hard on you with your mother being gone, having left the family, because he kept saying she left the family. And I told Dave Messmore, I said, I'm going to go to Florida with my father, and I'm not coming back. I'm going to drown in the Gulf of Mexico. And less than 2 days later, I woke up to a house flooded with police detectives, men and women in white lab coats, contraptions, and also 2 people from Children's Services that said, you have 20 minutes to pack a bag and we're getting out of here. And I asked, I said, what about my dog? And they said, we'll come back for your dog. I never saw my dog again, who I loved very much. So I went with my sister, and as we're coming down the stairs, I see all this police activity, and I just know that, okay, things aren't going to be the same. They already weren't the same. That night, I went to stay with my principal. That night, I had probably the worst asthma attack of my life because all of my medicine was at the house. I couldn't go back to the house that was now a crime scene, and I thought I was going to die. Next morning, I'm taken to the hospital, and after they stabilized me with a breathing treatment from a family friend who was a doctor, they tell me, Lieutenant Messmer found your mother, Collier, and she was dead. And that's where all this begins. I was angry, to say the least. I knew my father had murdered my mother, but I was also extremely sad because my father murdered my mother. It's very hard to articulate the sense of sort of relief that you're not crazy, that what you thought to be true was true. Also, that what you thought was true is possibly the most horrific thing you could ever imagine. I testified against my father to secure his indictment for murder of my mother.
I heard a scream. I heard a thud. It was about this loud.
I was then abandoned by both sides of my family. My mother's side of the family saying, we don't want anything to do with you because you look like your father. My father's side of the family saying, you're putting your father in prison, and they wanted to control that narrative. And I was remanded to the foster care system and orphaned. And during that time, over that 6 months of sort of almost isolation, because I was one of the key witnesses against my father, I had to muster up the strength and courage that my mother had instilled in me to testify against my father for 2 days at his months-long murder trial, and he is still incarcerated to this day. From an early age, I realized one thing, that none of this serves me at all if I don't make the best of this situation. It doesn't serve my mother's memory. It doesn't serve all the pain. And my mother is someone who taught me, and even my father to a certain extent, because he was a doctor. Now, granted, when you're a narcissist and a psychopath, you're doing those things because it's a reward system. It's all about them, right? Which is something I had to come to terms with because I couldn't understand why my father could be a healer, is that I was taught from a very early age to be grateful for what I have in my life, to be grateful that I had a mommy and daddy that loved me, as my mother would say, and a roof over my head and food on the table and toys to play with. And that I need to appreciate that other kids are less fortunate than you are. And it is that spirit of generosity, that spirit of self-awareness, that spirit of just integrity that my mother instilled in me as a child that is ultimately what led me through this. And when you're in foster care, it is a horrible situation. You're never comfortable. You don't know where you're going to live. You're always walking on eggshells. You talk about trauma responses. You have fight, flight, or fawning. I was fawning all the time because I didn't know if I said the wrong thing, which was threatened to me, by the way, I wouldn't get dinner or I wouldn't have a place to live. These things are also horrific things that are thrown in a child's face in the worst possible moment of their life. This was certainly thrown my way. It's a really tough situation. But I was determined, even then, to not let this be something that defined me. I knew that would serve no purpose. It certainly doesn't bring my mother back, and it certainly doesn't honor her memory. Her death would be in vain. And I always told myself that. And granted, I'm a human being. I have definitely had my share of mistakes I have made throughout my young life. But at the same time, I am very aware of what I had to do to move on. And that first step was to forgive my father. And I think a lot of people, I talk to if I'm doing trauma coaching with someone, or I'm talking about, I'm sharing my story, that process can be really hard for people, the forgiveness, because a lot of people mistake forgiveness with acceptance, condemnation. And it's not that. You forgiving someone or empowerment of the individual who has committed the offense against you. And that is something that's just not true, because it's all about you. That's what I have to tell people is that, you need to forgive that person for you to move on. And I realized that at a very, very young age, that this is what I needed to do to move on, because I did not want it to consume my life. And I think that's been the most unique part of when I share my story with people is they say to me, you're the outlier. You, for all intents and purpose, should be the guy under the bridge, muttering to themselves, shooting heroin, and no one would blame you. And for me, this story was not going to end that way. I decided, I went off to music school when I graduated high school. I was adopted finally when I was 13, about a year and change after all this happened. I moved into, I segued really hardcore into the arts when I was in high school, and I ended up going to music school. But after about 2.5 years, I just wasn't feeling fulfilled, and I dropped out because I wanted to get out of Ohio. I wanted to get away from everything. I wanted to get out of my small town because I wanted to make my own way in the world. I wanted to know, do people really like Collier for Collier? Or do people judge me for do they not like me for Collier? I wanted a clean slate. I wanted to know that however your perception of me is based solely upon your immediate perception of me and not the narrative that I walk into the room with. And if you don't know what that narrative is, you can't judge me except for who I am. So I know that if you really like me, if you're a girl and we're having a wonderful relationship, you really like me for Collier. You don't like me because of what happened to me, or you know the whole backstory, or what you think you can get out of me, whatever that might be, right? And it's a really liberating thing. So I, $2,000 in my pocket, moved to Los Angeles and said, I'm going to go into the arts and I'm going to find a way, tell my story, honor my mother, to heal myself and change one other person's life. And what ended up happening is I ended up changing a lot of people's lives. And I still continue to do that work. I learned the craft of filmmaking, and I made a film with a 2-time Academy Award winner named Barbara Koppel, and we made a documentary called A Murder in Mansfield. And all of that was done in a lot of ways because one thing always plagued me throughout all of this. And I maintained a relationship with my father too over these years because I wanted to understand, and I wanted to sort of to come to grips with the fact that, why did you murder my mother? And, you know, I went as far as to make a film to try to find that out from him. And I realized that the answer that I was seeking wasn't the answer that I needed. It was what you think you need to move on, you don't really do, because you already have. It's as cliche as it might sound, it is not about the finish line. It's about the journey. It's about the race. And then you get to that finish line and you realize that doesn't even matter. It was like, look at what I've done leading up and the work that I've put into myself and the life that I've cultivated and created. And that's what has ultimately been the biggest thing for me. And that's what I share with people. So I started a podcast called Moving Past Murder, which is my story of coming to grips with this and speaking to other people who are trauma survivors, whether it be in the true crime space or whatnot. I share letters from my father from prison to expose narcissism and psychopathy. I have people that are affected by what I'm doing in a positive way because they know they're not alone. And that's ultimately what I wanted to do. And that ultimately is what serves my mother and her memory. So I'm Collier Landry, and this is my story. I hope that you guys draw some inspiration from it, and I hope that you guys are inspired. You can follow me on social media. It's at Collier Landry. All the links are below. So thank you for listening.